Outnumbered, how to use the sun and clouds as weapons, how to keep calm when tracer rounds tore past his cockpit. He learned that victory in the air did not always go to the strongest or fastest, but to the pilot who understood his enemy, who could anticipate fear, overconfidence, hesitation. In the jungles of Burma, surrounded by danger and isolation, Howard transformed from a disciplined Navy flyer into a warrior of the sky. He became a hunter, patient and calculating, striking only when he knew he could win. These lessons would stay with him long after the Flying Tigers were disbanded, long after he returned home and joined the newly formed U.S. Army Air Forces. When he climbed into the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang in Europe, he carried with him the memory of those early battles, the sharp awareness that every second in the sky could be the difference between glory and death. By 1944, Howard was no longer the rejected young man from Pensacola. He was a major leading the 356th Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group, flying the P-51 Mustang on long-range escort missions deep into German territory. The Mustang was a revelation, fast, sleek, and deadly, capable of protecting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But technology alone could not win battles. It was the man behind the stick who made the difference. And James Howard, with his calm intensity and razor-sharp instincts, was about to face the moment that would define his life. On January 11, 1944, over Oschersleben, Germany, Howard's squadron was assigned to escort a formation of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers on a crucial daylight raid. The weather was poor, the mission dangerous, and the odds brutal. When they reached the target, a swarm of German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, descended on the bombers like hawks attacking prey. The sky turned into chaos, a deadly ballet of fire and steel. One by one, Howard's squadron became separated in the confusion, until he found himself utterly alone, one man against 30 enemy aircraft. In that moment, what he did would become the stuff of legend, a story that military historians would later call the greatest fighter pilot action of World War II. But before that day, before the medals and the headlines, Howard was simply a man who refused to surrender, a pilot who had been told he wasn't good enough, who had been rejected, and who now faced death not as an obstacle, but as a challenge to be mastered. January 11, 1944, the cold European air over Oschersleben, Germany, was sharp and heavy with tension. The mission that day was among the most dangerous yet attempted by the U.S. 8th Air Force, to cripple German aircraft production at its heart. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, the giants of the Allied air campaign, thundered through the sky in perfect formation, their silver fuselages gleaming in the pale sunlight. Each carried 10 men, each man carrying the same thought: would they make it home today? Their only shield from the deadly claws of the Luftwaffe were the escort fighters, slender, powerful P-51 Mustangs, whose job was to keep German fighters away from the bombers at all costs. Among these guardians was Major James H. Howard, commanding the 356th Fighter Squadron. Howard's Mustang, with its sleek frame and roaring Merlin engine, was both his weapon and his lifeline. Beneath his calm surface, Howard understood the stakes. This mission could make or break the air war over Germany. If the bombers succeeded, it would cripple the enemy's ability to produce the very planes now racing up to destroy them. As the American formation neared its target, the radio crackled with tension. Reports came in: bandits, 11 o'clock high. The Germans were coming, in numbers that defied belief. 30 or more enemy fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, swooped in from above and behind. To the B-17 crews, the sky seemed to explode. Tracers streaked like fiery comets, smoke trails coiled through the clouds, and engines screamed as fighters dove and climbed in a deadly dance. The air was alive with destruction. The German pilots were no amateurs, these were hardened veterans, flying with ruthless precision. They knew the bombers' weak points, and they struck with savage coordination. One by one, the flying fortresses began to take hits. Howard's radio was filled with shouts, coordinates, and chaos. It was the kind of battle that turned men into ghosts before they hit the ground. And amid it all, Howard's squadron began to scatter. Pilots were calling out for assistance, engines were failing, and soon, as the confusion grew thicker, Howard realized something chilling: he was alone. Most pilots, faced with those odds, would have broken away, regrouped, or at least waited for reinforcements. But Howard wasn't most pilots. Years of combat in the skies over Burma had taught him something essential: hesitation was death. He scanned the horizon, and there they were, the German fighters, diving on the bombers. Like wolves tearing into a herd. 30 against 1. The numbers were insane. But to Howard, there was no decision to make. His duty was clear: protect the bombers, no matter what. With a deep breath, he pushed his throttle forward, the Merlin engine screaming as his Mustang shot upward into the fray. What followed would defy logic, fear, and even death itself. He attacked head-on, his guns blazing, cutting across the enemy's formation like a streak of vengeance. Tracer rounds tore through the sky as Howard maneuvered with surgical precision, rolling, diving, and climbing in impossible angles. Every move was calculated, every burst of fire a statement: you will not touch them. The German pilots were caught off guard. At first, they couldn't believe one American had attacked an entire formation. They thought he must have backup, that other Mustangs were nearby, hidden in the clouds. But as the minutes passed, it became clear: there was only one. Howard used every trick he had learned from his years with the Flying Tigers, diving from the sun to blind his opponents, feinting retreat to lure them in, then spinning back into attack with perfect timing. He moved through the sky like a ghost, never staying still, never giving them a clear shot. German bullets ripped through the air, some striking his plane, others missing by inches. One burst tore into his wing. Another shattered his radio. Yet still, he fought. His Mustang was hit, but Howard kept flying, adjusting controls with steady hands. He climbed again, turned, and fired, bringing down one of the enemy fighters in a burst of flame. Then another. Then another. The bomber crews below watched in disbelief. From their gun turrets, they could see one lone Mustang weaving among the enemy, standing between them and destruction. Over the intercom, voices shouted, "Who is that guy?" The battle raged for more than 30 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. 30 minutes of non-stop fighting, of dodging death with every heartbeat. Howard's ammunition began to run low, yet he refused to pull back. He used his plane itself as a weapon, diving through enemy formations to break their attacks, forcing them to scatter. His presence alone disrupted the German assault, buying precious time for the bombers to reach their target. Smoke filled the air, pieces of metal rained down, and the once-ordered sky had become a chaotic storm. Still, Howard's Mustang carved through it with relentless will. Every dive, every roll, every burst of gunfire was the act of a man who had already accepted death, and decided to fight anyway. The German pilots, frustrated and confused, began to retreat. They couldn't comprehend how one man could fight with such precision and audacity. To them, it was as if an entire squadron was attacking. They withdrew to regroup, leaving Howard battered but unbroken, circling alone above the battered bomber group he had just saved. When the American bombers finally made it home, the crews were stunned. They spoke of the one crazy Mustang pilot who had stood between them and annihilation. Reports flooded the debriefing rooms: he fought 30 of them alone. He never left us. He just kept coming. The name of that pilot soon spread across the airfields of England. Major James Howard had done what no one thought possible, faced 30 German fighters single-handedly and lived to tell about it. His Mustang returned riddled with bullet holes, his guns nearly empty, but his spirit untouched. That day, he didn't just protect the bombers, he rewrote the unwritten rules of courage in the air. The mission's success was not measured in bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but in the hearts of the men who made it back alive because one man refused to back down. When James Howard's P-51 Mustang finally touched down at Boxted Airfield in England, the ground crew was stunned at the sight of it. The aircraft was riddled with holes, bullet punctures along the fuselage, torn metal along the wings, and streaks of burned paint where cannon shells had grazed the surface. To anyone who saw it, the damage told a silent story of survival against impossible odds. Howard climbed out of the cockpit with calm precision, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his face marked with exhaustion but composed as ever. There was no boast, no grand statement of victory. He simply reported his plane's condition, mentioned that he had engaged several enemy fighters, and walked away quietly. To his squadron mates, it was just another mission, until the bomber crews began to return. One after another, they came in, each with stories that defied belief. Gunners, pilots, and navigators all told the same thing: a lone P-51 Mustang had stayed with them through the thick of battle, attacking relentlessly, refusing to flee, and saving their formation from destruction. They described his moves, his courage, his defiance. Some swore it had to be multiple aircraft. No one believed a single pilot could do what they had witnessed. But as reports were cross-checked, it became clear, it was one man. Major James Howard. Word spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. Combat stories traveled fast in those days, passed between mess halls, briefing tents, and flight lines. But this one was different. Pilots who had seen everything, men hardened by months of missions, stopped what they were doing to listen. He fought 30 of them. Alone. And he came back alive. The story took on a mythic quality, not because it was exaggerated, but because it captured something deeply human, the idea that one person could stand against impossible odds and prevail through will, skill, and sheer defiance. The U.S. Army Air Forces began an official investigation to confirm the accounts. They interviewed bomber crews, studied gun camera footage, and reconstructed the battle minute by minute. Every account matched. The evidence was irrefutable. Major James Howard had single-handedly engaged 30 German fighters for over half an hour, protected an entire bomber formation, and survived. For that act, he was recommended for the highest military honor, the Medal of Honor. But recognition did not come overnight. Howard continued flying missions, maintaining the same calm professionalism that had defined him from the start. He was not interested in glory, he was interested in doing his duty. To his men, he was an example of quiet leadership, someone who didn't command with rank or orders, but by the strength of his actions. The Medal of Honor citation took months to process, but the legend of that day had already spread far beyond the airfields of England. Newspapers in America began publishing stories about the lone Mustang pilot. The narrative captured the imagination of a nation weary from years of war. In an era where headlines were filled with loss and destruction, Howard's act of defiance stood as a symbol of hope and determination. He became the living embodiment of the American fighting spirit, not because he sought it, but because he lived it. He had proven that one man's courage could make a difference, even in the vast machinery of total war. When the official announcement came, it carried with it a sense of reverence. Major James H. Howard was to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions over Ostersleben, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it. The ceremony was held in June 1944, with General Karl Spaatz presenting the award. Standing before his peers, Howard looked as composed as ever. He accepted the medal not as a personal trophy, but as a recognition of every man who had fought and flown alongside him. In his brief speech, he gave credit to his fellow pilots, to the bomber crews, and to the spirit of teamwork that made such missions possible. Yet, for everyone in attendance, there was no doubt that Howard's courage had transcended mere duty. He had shown that heroism was not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it, alone if necessary. The press captured his image, his calm eyes, his modest smile, and for a time, he became the face of Allied air power. To many Americans, his story was proof that determination and discipline could overcome any odds. But beyond the medals and headlines, there was a deeper significance to what Howard had done. His mission symbolized a turning point in the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang, once doubted for its range and performance, had proven itself as the ultimate escort fighter. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in the skies, began to feel the weight of Allied strength pressing down upon it. Every German pilot who took off after that day knew that somewhere above the clouds, there might be another Howard, another lone Mustang pilot willing to stand and fight no matter the odds. Howard's legacy rippled across the airfields of the Allied world. Young pilots studied his tactics, commanders quoted his calm defiance, and even enemy reports acknowledged his unmatched skill. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers documented the engagement, describing the unknown pilot's extraordinary aggression and superior tactical control. For Howard, that was the ultimate validation, respect not just from allies, but from those he fought against. In the months that followed, Howard continued to serve with distinction, leading missions, training younger pilots, and ensuring that the lessons of his experience were passed on. He never allowed his fame to overshadow his responsibilities. To him, the Medal of Honor was not a conclusion, but a reminder, that courage was a daily decision, made every time a pilot. In the years that followed World War II, Major James H. Howard's name became synonymous with an almost mythical kind of courage, the kind that transcends the battlefield and becomes part of the moral fabric of a generation. His story was told and retold not as a tale of victory alone, but as a lesson in what it means to stand firm when everything around you collapses. To historians, his January 11, 1944 mission remained one of the purest examples of individual valor ever recorded in the annals of aerial warfare. Yet, for Howard himself, the years after the war were not about reliving his glory, but about living with quiet dignity, carrying forward the same calm sense of duty that had guided him through that day over Ostersleben. He would later write that courage is not found in moments of triumph, but in the decision to act when fear is strongest, when the rational mind says, turn back, but something deeper says, go forward. That philosophy defined the rest of his life, both in and out of uniform. After the war ended, Howard transitioned from the battlefield to a new kind of service, to his country, to aviation, and to the generations who would follow. He remained in the Air Force for several years before eventually retiring as a brigadier general, but he never lost his passion for flight. He became an advocate for aviation safety, a mentor to young pilots, and a living reminder that heroism was not about reckless bravery but disciplined courage. In interviews, he was modest, always redirecting praise toward others. "I wasn't thinking about medals," he once said, "I was thinking about keeping those bombers alive." His humility resonated with those who had seen too much of war's vanity. For the men who had been in those bombers, his name carried a sacred weight. Many of them wrote to him, years later, telling him that their families existed because of that one day, that because he stayed, they survived. It was a legacy that stretched far beyond the medals, far beyond the pages of history books. It was a legacy written in lives saved, in futures that might never have existed without one man's decision to fight alone. In the post-war years, Howard's story became a cornerstone of American aviation legend. Military academies studied his tactics, leadership schools analyzed his decision-making, and airmen around the world cited his name as an example of what true professionalism in combat looked like. His Medal of Honor action was incorporated into U.S. Air Force training material, not as a piece of nostalgia, but as a living case study in courage under extreme pressure. His ability to remain calm while facing overwhelming odds became a model of what psychologists would later term combat composure. They would describe it as the rare ability to control adrenaline and focus the mind completely in the chaos of battle, a quality Howard possessed in abundance. To the young pilots of the jet age, he represented a bridge to the past, a reminder that technology could change, but the essence of courage remained the same. Every generation of fighter pilots that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to modern conflicts, would find in Howard's story a measure of what it meant to be an aviator and a warrior. But beyond military circles, Howard's legacy also spoke to something far more universal. It reminded people that greatness can come from rejection, that the ones the world overlooks often become the ones who change it. The boy who had once been told he wasn't fit to fly had gone on to earn his wings, fight in 2 wars, and become one of the most decorated pilots in American history. His life proved that resilience is born not from privilege, but from perseverance. When others might have accepted failure, Howard turned it into fuel. That message carried a profound power in post-war America, a nation rebuilding itself, redefining courage not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life. Schools told his story. Newspapers celebrated him not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of moral strength. He had shown that even in the darkest skies, one person's resolve could light the way forward. For decades after, whenever the topic of bravery in combat arose, James H. Howard's name stood among the greatest, not for the number of enemies he shot down, but for the unshakable calm with which he faced the impossible. In the twilight of his life, when asked how he wanted to be remembered, Howard gave an answer that reflected the same humility that had defined his entire career. He said, "I'd like to be remembered as someone who did his job." Those words carried the essence of his legacy, simple, steadfast, and true. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 81, leaving behind not only a record of valor but a moral blueprint for generations of aviators and ordinary people alike. His Medal of Honor, displayed today in museums and history halls, serves as a silent testament to that day in 1944 when one man, against 30 enemies, refused to give in. His Mustang, the aircraft that carried him through fire and chaos, has been preserved as a relic of defiance, a symbol of how far courage can take a person when fear is pushed aside. In films, books, and documentaries, his story continues to echo, reminding every listener that true heroism is not about being fearless, but about flying straight into fear and doing your duty anyway. The sky over Oschersleben has long since fallen silent, but somewhere in that endless blue, the spirit of James H. Howard still soars, the lone Mustang who defied death, outnumbered but never outmatched, his courage forever etched into the clouds of history.